but even so, you have a thing like Klinefelter's syndrome. So you don't know what you're talking about. You're not educated on genetics.
Would you like to discuss the genetics? Or
well, no,
what
no.
Are your genetics?
So I'd stay away from the genetics and back to the brain scans.
You cut that out now, or you'll go home in an ambulance.
Yeah, that seems mildly inappropriate for a political discussion.
Well, the problem is twofold here. One is what's actually being taught in certain ethnic studies classes, which tends to be on a myopic focus on the idea that America is a racist place against certain ethnicities and minorities. The second point here is just the giant waste of taxpayer dollars that this constitutes. Look, I took Jewish studies courses when I was at UCLA. There are only two reasons that you take a Jewish studies course. The first is to meet girls, and the second is to get an easy A. And that's why most students are taking ethnic studies courses unless they're buying into this radical ideology that really is the basis of all ethnic studies courses throughout America.
Absolute nonsense, Peter.
You didn't write that
my position on Israel was made clear in the 2013 column, and to call me equivalent with people who are murdering Jews is insanity. It's beyond insulting. And if there's anybody who's emboldening Hamas to kill more children, it is you, because it's your policies which have emboldened Hamas. They know that people like you are going to get on American television and talk about how the Palestinians are meek victims, and whenever they fire rockets, it can be justified by Israeli policy. Hamas celebrates every moment you're on television, Peter. Relationship between employer and employee, and I think this is really the root of the morality of minimum wage when it comes down to it. And in two sentences here is that I would never force an employee to work for an employer at a given wage. That violates the 13th Amendment and constitutes slavery or indentured servitude. By the same token, I would never force an employer to pay a given wage to an employee, because that is a lack of consent on the part of the employer and violates basic principles of fairness as well as freedom. You to consider, you can believe what you want, but I would ask you to consider this. Shouting institutional racism does not actually combat racism. You have to find individual instances, and you have to show me who the racists are so that we can fight them together. I hate racism. I think it's evil. But if you're just going to say institutional racism every time something bad happens, there's no way to fight it. I need a policy that you're proposing, or I need a person who's actually racist so that we can fight it together, or we can determine whether the policy is good. What I find really problematic is the virtue signaling that I see by so many people on the other side, which is, I don't have to give you the racist, I don't have to tell you who he is or what measures I'm proposing. I just say institutional racism, everybody cheers for me because that's an approved point of view, and now we move on with our lives. You haven't helped anybody, you've just made yourself feel better. If you want to, have her respond, please.
Well, I think that institutional racism in and of itself, first of all, I would say that the majority of the people that do bring up institutional racism do also have solutions as to how to combat it. But
which invariably involve encroaching on other people's liberty. But yes.
Well, I would just say that there is kind of, again, I feel like you're painting a wide and diverse group of people with the same brush and saying that if you can't point to a policy or if you can't point to a person, then you're just wasting everyone's time. And I think that a lot of people are trying to point to policies, and while I think that the idea of pointing to a racist person is fundamentally in contrast with the idea of institutional racism, because institutional racism grapples with implicit bias in the society as a whole, or not like a ghost in the machine, but in individuals.
Unless you're connecting that to a policy, it's a cop-out. Because now we're ghost hunting again. If you just said to me, we have a problem in American society, income inequality, right, is a problem in American society. If you just gave me any problem, and I said, well, that's the Bilderbergs' fault, right? That's the fault of the Bilderbergs, right? It's a conspiracy. It's the fault of the Bilderbergs, right? There are all these conspiracy theories about the Bilderberg group. Now, let's say that it's the Bilderbergs' fault, or it's the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's whatever it is. There's some conspiracy out there. You would say to me that's not useful because what are you even talking about? When you say institutional racism, it's too broad. You at least have to name me the institution. Which one is the racist one? Which institution is racist? Tell me which, so we can fight it, seriously, so we can fight it together. Just shouting slogans like institutional racism it's not effective. Shouting white privilege is not effective. I want to be on your side. I do. I want to fight racists. I think racist behavior is evil. I want to fight it with you, but I can't fight it if you're not showing me what it is. And we have to decide together if the policies you're proposing will alleviate racism or exacerbate racism. And it turns out, I think, that a lot of the policies proposed by the left, I think institutional racism is usually a lever for proposing a policy that is actually unpalatable to freedom, and then castigating people on the other side of that policy as being in league with the institutional racism. balance is to show Israel's side and then Hamas's side and then claim that that balance has been achieved. Well, that's the sort of media coverage that would have led to the West losing World War II. So I'm not a big fan of that sort of balance.
But then you're the one who's actually equating Hamas and Palestinian civilians. Those are not equal.
The hell I am.
Why would you do that? Hamas
is
a terror. Because you're saying that when the media shows civilians being killed, they're somehow propping up Hamas. That's not true.
That is not what I said.
You're saying...
I did not say that at all. I said you feel free to show civilians being killed. What I suggested is that you should provide all the context for those civilians being killed. And as far as the other woman who's on with me, I'm not familiar with her name. You know, as far as her personal insults, I mean, I'm not going to get into the quality of the movies that are made based on her books. I think that we can all stay away from that.
Rula.
Of black families have zero or negative wealth. White family worth, in terms of financial worth, is 69 times more than that of black families. Given this disparity, how can you argue that racism is not a driving factor in income inequality?
Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. And when you have a culture that doesn't... You know what? Explain to me. You explain to me why black kids aren't graduating high school. Explain that one to me. Explain to me why black kids are shooting each other in rates significantly higher than whites are shooting each other. Explain to me why 13% of the population is responsible for 50% of the murder. Explain to me why the number of black kids in prison, not for innocent reasons, not for walking down the street and getting pulled into a prison, is so high. Explain, if it has nothing to do with culture, explain to me why the single motherhood rate in the black community jumped from 20% to 70% in the same course of time that the civil rights movement has made such tremendous strides. Is America more racist now than it was in 1960? And if it is, please explain to me how that happened.
I think the reason that it's about left and right here is because fundamentally the right believes that the basis for the Second Amendment, and they believe in the Second Amendment, the basis for the Second Amendment is not really about self-defense and it's not about hunting. It is about resistance to government tyranny. That's what the founders said, and that's what the right believes in this country.
Which tyranny are you fearing yourself?
I fear the possibility of a tyranny rising in this country in the next 50 to 100 years. Let me tell you something, Piers. The fact that my grandparents and great-grandparents in Europe didn't fear that is why they are now ashes in Europe. So this kind of leftist revisionist history, where there's never any fear of democracy going usurpacious or tyrannical, is just that. It is fictitious.
Let's start with the notion of white privilege, which has become this buzzword that you hear all the time now. White privilege is responsible for everything up to and including the Kardashians. It's responsible for everything, white privilege. White privilege is a way to silence anybody who is not of color. That's what white privilege is. It is just a leftist bullshit term that means shut up because you are not a member of a minority group, a privileged minority group in the leftist space. It's reverse racism of the highest order. You're basically saying to white people who aren't racist, and you can't find any proof of their racism, that they must be racist because they're white. That is called racism. If you are accusing somebody of something simply because of the color of their skin without any evidence, that's called racism, gang.
Statistical disparity, and you determine that that is not a racial disparity, it's something else. Well, we can return to it. That's okay too. Ben, do you want to?
Yes. It's called evidence of racism. When there is no evidence of racism, it's probably not racism. When there is actual evidence of racism, it's probably racism. And the fact that everybody jumps from there's inequality and therefore there is inequity, just because there's inequality does not mean there was inequity.
But there has to be racism. You can't say there's no racism.
Without evidence?
No. I'm just saying that I don't know which animal. Maybe we're talking about dogs or something. I'm talking about human beings, and I'm like, human beings are most likely going to have racial prejudices. I'm just so sorry. I'm just so sorry. I don't know. I come from planet Earth.
Charles, I want to ask you a question. So your default is that when there is no evidence, racism is the deciding factor. That is
no, I was not saying that. I'm just saying that you're going to have sexists, you're going to have racists, you're going to have all this stuff. I mean, I'm just saying that...
I agree it exists, but the problem that I'm seeing, and this is the problem with the general conversation, is that there's no solution in simply saying there's racism out there. How does that solve anything? I mean, when you talk about there's institutional racism, what does that mean? Show me a law that is racist in intent, and we will agree. Show me a police officer who commits a racist act like we saw in South Carolina, right, where a police officer shot a black man running away and it was obviously unjustified, and I will agree. But The idea that you can craft a narrative based on no racism because it just must be somewhere out there in the ether, that doesn't solve problems for anybody and creates more problems for people, because now they grow up in a milieu and an environment where they are told that every obstacle they face is from some shadowy, nameless, faceless group who's out to get them simply because of the color of their skin. They'll never succeed in that environment.
Here's the deal with white privilege. Because white privilege always assumes racism without evidence, always assumes racism without evidence, when there is no racism, they simply make up the evidence with regard to white privilege. So here at Mizzou, they just make up the evidence of white privilege. They can't find evidence of white privilege, so what they do is they just make it up. Right? They make up stories about how a poop swastika, which I'm Jewish, okay? Swastikas aren't aimed at black people. Okay, a poop swastika in a bathroom somewhere, this is somehow evidence of a grand racist conspiracy led by Tim Wolf. Right? Okay. I wasn't aware that Tim Wolf scrawls poop swastikas in his spare time. Right? When it comes to stories like Jonathan Butler's story about how he was hit by the president's car, he was hit by Tim Wolf's car. If you watch the tape, he was not hit by Tim Wolf's car. There's a thing called video, gang. You should use it. Okay, he jumps in front of the car and steps into the car. Okay, he acts like your kid acts, or you used to act when you were a kid and you didn't want to get in trouble for hitting your sibling, so you took your sibling's hand and hit them in the face and said, "Stop hitting yourself." Okay, that's what Jonathan Butler did, and then he claimed that he was a victim of systemic racism thanks to this, and then went on a hunger strike, the answer to which should have been, okay, so starve. On this issue, because what you do, and I've seen it repeatedly on your show, I watch your show, and I've seen it repeatedly, what you tend to do is you tend to demonize people who differ from you politically by standing on the graves of the children of Sandy Hook, saying they don't seem to care enough about the dead kids. If they cared more about the dead kids, they would agree with you on policy. I think we can have a rational political conversation about balancing rights and risks and rewards of all of these different policies, but I don't think that what we need to do is demonize people on the other side.
Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the precedent in California for a second. In California, there are 30,000 mentally ill people who have guns. They have a grand total of 33 people, really, in the state of California who are tasked with taking these 30,000 guns away from these 30,000 mentally ill people. Okay, we're creating a system that is either not going to be enforced or it's going to be over-enforced. This idea, if we can just trust the government, then why aren't we just trusting the government to do the right thing now? I don't understand why a piece of legislation makes them better at what they do. I mean, the government is not very good at what they're doing now. Why does new wording make them not suck?
Because part of the reason...
Judge, and say whether or not he should be considered someone who is a hero and inspirational to other young men out there.
Well, here's actually the problem that I have. I think that you can accept and tolerate people's behavior, and that, demonstrates non-homophobia. I think that it is ridiculous to suggest that just because you're not celebrating, on the cover of Sports Illustrated, somebody coming out of the closet, and you think, it's relatively unimportant in the grand scheme of things because people should be able to live their lives the way that they want. I don't really understand. There were folks who were saying that that was a homophobic tweet. I'm still confused as to how it's homophobic simply to say that you don't think it's a heroic move in today's America to come out of the closet the same way that it was maybe 20 years ago.
Jared.
Let me ask you this way. Do you think that there's sexism in America?
I think there's sexism in America, actually.
No, is there sexism?
If there are sexists who perform sexist acts, then there's sexism.
No, not America.
So you're asking, is America structurally sexist? The answer is no.
Women are underrepresented in 270 years of the White House because...
Okay, so I'm not saying there wasn't historic sexism as far as the White House. Was that it has faded away gradually to the point where women are now... This is how change happens.
It has not.
The fact is that when it comes to college admissions, for example, there are more women than men going to college.
That's correct.
When it comes to graduate schools, there are more women than men going to graduate schools.
Yes.
Okay, when it comes to jail, which you just cited, the vast, well over 90% of the people in jail are men. Is that because the system is sexist against men? That the jailing system is now sexist against men because there are more men than women in prison? That's really your argument?
No, it does happen to also be the case that more men commit crimes.
There you go.
Most dealers are good. Gun dealers are good. Let me finish. But the NRA has all but neutered the ATF. all but neutered, and there are, well, we haven't had an ATF director for the last 10 years. We haven't had an ATF director for the last 10 years because the NRA won't even allow us to have a Surgeon General because the guy wanted common sense gun control.
Well, the ATF is a little bit busy smuggling guns south of the border to the drug cartels.
Oh, come on.
The other reason is that in order to become a professor, you do have to go through a certain process, and that process is run by liberals. So if you have tenured professors deciding who's to become a professor, if they're the ones who are reading the papers that professors have to write in order to become professors, if they're doing the hiring, then they're going to be biased in a certain way. Now, it may not be conscious. I think that probably they would think of themselves as relatively unbiased when it comes to figuring out who's a good teacher and who's not. But the problem is that a lot of professors, because they're an ivory tower, they don't even recognize that the other perspective has validity. And that being the case, they really believe that what they're saying is pure fact. So anything else must necessarily be falsehood. There's no reason to give falsehood a place in the classroom.
If their employees all thought that God's will was the same thing that the owners of Hobby Lobby think God's will is, there wouldn't be an issue here, would they? Because they could give the insurance, whatever insurance, and they could rest assured that their employees would choose like they would.
The question in Hobby Lobby is whose freedom is being infringed upon. Employees' freedom is not infringed upon when they enter into a consensual relationship with an employer that includes certain types of health care.
It's not consensual.
Of course it is. They can quit. Who is forcing them? Where is the gun?
Huh?
Where is the gun? Who is forcing them? Where is the chain? Who is locking them to their desk?
Stop with the gun language.
The reason that I use the gun language is because it is vitally important for people to understand that every government measure at the end of the day it must be compelled by force. That's what government measures are for. There is a vast difference, a huge difference in terms of personal liberty and freedom between the government compelling behavior and a company saying that we are not going to provide certain types of coverage, and if you don't like that, you can quit or buy your own coverage. There's a vast difference. The gun's the whole issue.
Health insurance is an earned benefit. It's not given for free to employees. They earn it. Should your employer be able to decide how you spend your money?
It is, hold up. Hold on. One second. Earned from whom? Okay, I may think that I earn twice the salary that I get from this radio station. That doesn't mean that I have an earned benefit from the radio station for twice what they're willing to pay me. It's always a consensual relationship.
You pay for your health care?
Well, first of all, I do because it was negotiated in the contract that I signed, in which I voluntarily engaged. And if I don't like that, I can quit tomorrow.
Shapiro, from your newest book, Bullies, you write, President Obama was elected at least in part because he was black. It was a positive for him. Many Americans believed that America needed to elect its first black president to move beyond issues of race once and for all. Instead, they got a champion race bully masquerading as a racial unifier. What do you mean?
What I mean by that is that President Obama came into office on this great wave of American approval, this idea that he was going to unify the country along racial lines. Instead, what's happened is that the president has really suggested in multiple ways not only the continuation of American racism, but that is one of the most serious problems still facing the country. We've seen it in everything, manifest in everything from the George Zimmerman trial to the continued focus on voter ID, the attempt by the Obama administration to paint voter ID as a racist thing as opposed to an attempt to quash voter fraud. The questioning the motivations of the American people, or at least his opponents, is something that President Obama likes to do on a pretty frequent basis, and it pays tremendous dividends. And the only sector of the racial population that showed up in larger numbers than the previous election cycle in 2012 was the black community. They showed up in numbers far outweighing their proportion in the population, which is great. I mean, it's wonderful they showed up. Unfortunately, a lot of folks showed up because they were convinced that by voting for President Obama, they were stopping a great racist tide that had kind of swum up to the surface against President Obama, as opposed to just people who opposed him politically.
So when you hear the term...
Explain. Who are the bullies?
The bullies in America are the left, and internationally they're the left as well. But what the left has done in the United States is something very clever. They've suggested that they are the people who stand up for all of the various victim groups in the United States, and then by necessity, everybody who opposes them is therefore opposed to victims, and they're the real thugs, and they shouldn't even be part of the conversation. That's why whenever you see Democrats out there, they're always talking about how Republicans have nefarious and evil motives, right? They're racists, they're sexists, they're homophobes, they are only standing up for the rich, they hate the poor.
That's the kind of way that the Democrats achieve their goal. Liberals in the United States don't want to have a conversation. They simply want to remove conservatives from kind of the legitimate mainstream political conversations so that they don't have to discuss what's the best policy for the most Americans. And so I'm sitting there and I'm rocking the baby back and forth, and I find myself tearing up. And the reason that I'm tearing up is because it's occurring to me for the first time, like it does for a lot of new parents, I would imagine, for the first time, which is there's going to come a point where my baby is crying and I'm not going to be there. Right? There will be a point where, you know, sometime, God willing, 90 years down the road, there's a problem in her life and I'm not going to be there to solve it. And she has to have the freedom and the capacity to solve the problem for herself. Evil enervates us. Evil takes that power away from us. It takes away our ability, our will. It saps us of our God-given capacity to solve problems on our own and to make the world a better place and to rock our children to sleep at night, because after all, that's not our job. It takes a village. Freedom is about the future. It's about what we want to give our kids. And our job is to fight collectivist evil. It's to fight collectivism. Yes, freedom succeeds and freedom wins, but only if we fight. Don't be afraid, though. The nice thing about the Ten Commandments, there's a whole bunch of books that come along with it. And we learn in one of them, in Isaiah 8:10, God is with us. Isaiah writes, devise your strategy, but it will be thwarted. Propose your plan, but it will not stand, for God is with us. And God is with us. He is with us, and God will be with us for so long as we forge forth to fight for the